All right. Hey there, and welcome to this episode where we're going to talk about the fear of blurting out obscenities or insults. And so, this is a pretty common form of anxiety and OCD, right? Where the person basically struggles with this idea of what if I yell impulsively, right? A specific word or phrase. And generally speaking, the person's afraid of a very specific word, right? Like, what if I yell the F word, right? Or what if I yell a racist, a racial slur, right? Specifically, usually towards a person, right? So, and again, it could be anything, right? And oftentimes these fears are very contextual too, right? Meaning in certain environments. So this might be at work, might be the biggest triggering area. Like, what if I'm in a meeting and I just yell out this horrible thing about my boss in front of the meeting, right? Or what if I'm at church and I yell out some obscenity about God or Jesus, right? These kind of thoughts, right, will pop up, and then what will happen is these thoughts will produce anxiety, which will then again lead the person to engaging in different behaviors to try to, quote, keep themselves safe, right? Now, one of the things is that generally speaking, the people that I've worked with that have had these particular fears, are generally very, straight line walkers, right? Like they've never done anything like this in the past. In fact, just the idea of doing something like this is so beyond them, which is often why it's so distressing, right? Someone who really, has these like racial ideations or these horrible, ideations and thinking things and saying things like that to other people, it doesn't cause them anxiety, right? Because they actually, align with that, kind of thinking, right? The people that we're talking about with these kind of fears, these ideas and this kind of language is often so repulsive to them because it's so uncharacteristic of who they really are, right? And that's what, again, is causing a lot of that reaction to it. So when it comes to, treating this or working with this, right, and overcoming this, again, it's kind of the same kind of three parts that we've been breaking down in this fear series, right? The first is diffusing from that thought, right? Diffusing from thoughts in general. So when you're having thoughts in your mind, realizing that you're the one that's experiencing the thought. You aren't the thought itself. You aren't the content of the mind. You're the context of the situation. You're the experiencer. You're the one who hears it, right? So much of the distress is caused from where this thought came from, right? Like that's so much of the questions I get is like, well, why would I have this thought? Like, why would my mind even produce this thought? And again, the repelled feeling of like, just, I can't believe that this thought is happening in my head. But that reaction to it, paradoxically, is what's creating that thought to happen more and more and more, right? Because when we're reacting to something as if it's bad, and we're teaching our brain that like, hey man, this is terrible, we can't have this, then our brain kind of goes in this alarm system mode and keeps producing it, right? And the more and more we engage in behaviors that reinforce that it's bad, the more our brain produces it, the higher the anxiety goes, and then this loop just builds, right? So this is where, people will... So that first part is really, disengaging from the thoughts themselves and realizing that that's not you. Second part, becomes, well, what are the behaviors you're engaging in that are perpetuating that loop, right? Because there's the four main components. You have the thought, the feelings or the anxiety, the stress or guilt, or, whatever the feeling, the negative feeling is. I'll say the uncomfortable feeling. I don't know that I even like the word negative. What's the uncomfortable feeling that you have associated with that thought? And then the behavior that you're engaging in to neutralize the feeling or the thought that provides the temporary relief that keeps the loop going, right? And so what we do is we look to break the behaviors because those are the things that we have control over. If we try to control the thoughts or feelings, again, it's going to keep that loop going. So when it comes to those thoughts specifically, we want to look at, hey, what are the environmental triggers that really produce those, right? Is it at work? Is it at church? Is it at, home? Is it in front of your kids? Is it in front of, we want to get clear on where those thoughts are most prevalent. And then we want to learn, like, what are the actual thoughts, right? Part of it is really surfacing this. And this is what happens so much, is people are so ashamed of these thoughts that they just never tell anyone. You know, I can't tell you how many people I've talked to that it's like, hey man, I've just had these thoughts for the last 10 years, 20 years, right? So part of it is really eliminating the shame from this and realizing that it's not you, right? Like you aren't this terrible person that's producing these thoughts. These thoughts are popping up in your head. Yes, you're experiencing them. And part of the way that we know that this is not you is because you're so guilty and ashamed by them and anxious by them, right? And you know, separating that ego dystonic and ego syntonic, right? You know, from these thoughts don't align with what you really want. And then we start to remove the behaviors, right, through progressive exposure and response prevention. So if there is certain movies that trigger the thoughts, if there's certain, you know, just even writing out the phrase, you know, oftentimes I'll have people write out the phrase and keep it in their pocket at the actual event, right? You know, that'll be one of the higher level exposures. But again, we start to really just remove the behaviors. And once we remove the behaviors, and we progressively face this, the anxiety subsides, and then eventually it can become something that, like, you know, you get to the point where you're just like, I can't believe I ever worried about that. But the only way that that happens, again, is through the systematic, you know, desensitization, through the behavior exposure and response prevention, really targeting those behaviors. So that's how we would actually address that. And so hopefully that's helpful. And if this is something you struggle with, I mean, you know, please, you know, we have resources over at restoredminds.com. There's links down below where you can access, you know, different downloads as well as additional trainings. We have a full, you know, webinar that you can go through for free. You know, just to really realize that this is not something that you can't overcome. You can. And you know, really, it's just about learning the correct strategies and how to do it appropriately, and realizing that these thoughts are not you, right? And that's the realizing that the behavior change is actually where we need to focus our efforts. So hopefully this was helpful. And again, if you found this helpful, please help us out by liking, subscribing, and sharing. And we look forward to seeing you on the next episode. Take care.
Thank you for taking the time to watch this video. If you found it helpful, chances are someone else will too, and we'd really appreciate your support by liking and subscribing, and also sharing this video on your social platforms. Also, if you're looking for additional help, we have some resources right down in the links below to help you on your journey. Thanks so much for tuning in, and I hope to see you soon.